Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a workshop on how to make a role-playing game. My name is Steve D, and I'm the president and founder of Tin Star Games. We make regular tabletop role. We make tabletop role-playing games and regular tabletop games, non-role-playing ones. This workshop is being produced for the Global Game Jam, which starts on the 31st of January. The lovely folks at Queerly Represent Me have asked a lot of people in the community to produce workshops with as much training information as possible so that anyone who's at all interested in getting into game design can listen to a workshop and get the skills they need to jump in and start making their own games. I also run a thing called the Game Design Masterclass, which is a paid course that we can do. We run over about half a day that teaches you how to make board games, and there'll be lots more information about that. And of course, Tin Star Games in the links around this project. What we're going to focus on here today is how to make a role-playing game. I've designed about half a dozen small role-playing games myself, and I've worked as a freelancer for 20 years in the industry in all sorts of capacities. And I have recently kickstarted my large role-playing game Relics, which will be out in PDF form in February this year, with the print version to follow close behind. We thought we'd do this today, though, as a question and answer rather than me just talking, because one of the difficult things is when you've worked in a field for a long time is you don't always know what other people want to know. So I've asked my good friend Sean from State of Mind Games to act as the question asker, and we've also asked some other people to submit some questions, and there are also some lovely people are listening in on our Discord channel, the Tin Star Games Discord channel. So I'm going to throw this over to Sean, who will also introduce himself, and then start asking me some questions.
Hi everyone. As Steve said, I work at State of Mind Games. I've been designing tabletop games and the odd PC or app game. I've played RPGs, but I've never designed them. It interests me, so when I had this chance, I thought, excellent, I can chuck some of my questions in. Okay, so we may as well get straight into it. This one came from me. With tabletop games, Steve, there's a lot of discussion about whether it's better to design mechanism first or theme first, but I'm guessing that for RPGs, it's probably theme first.
It's a really good question. In many ways, the format of a role-playing game is quite set, and it is a device that is used to be telling a story. And therefore, yes, in many ways, you are starting with, well, what kind of story do I want to tell, and what are the ways that I'm going to tell that story? But there are still ways that you can come at the question mechanically. You may come at it from the question of, I have an idea of how to pass around story, or I have an idea of how to model some aspect of combat or conflict, and that may suggest itself towards a story. And very often you're often dealing with if in many cases you're working with a system that already exists in some aspects, and then you're tuning that to a particular story. So certainly more than board games, story and the theme that you're trying to reach tends to be present, but it can vary, and it does have an ebb and flow. Certainly for myself, in history of my design, I've tended to design mostly games that around settings that already existed, so that I definitely had a goal that I was working towards, something I was trying to emulate. And that's something that I found really natural and easy to just go, right, how do I tell these kind of stories? What are the important things to make those stories come alive at the table with the kind of mechanics that I'm probably going to be using and the players that I have.
Okay, well that sounds pretty much where I thought it may go to.
Yeah.
But it moves nicely onto character stats. In my limited experience, I haven't played an RPG that hasn't required some form of character stats to help you drive and determine what actions your character can take that's still believable for the game world. So how much influence can they have in how you structure the world? And I'm going to roll this into what I had for the next question. because I suppose that helps determine what stats you need. But how do you do it so that you work out what's nice to have for stats before it becomes overcomplicated or not enough to drive your story and develop your world?
Yeah, I mean, the art of role playing game design very often comes back to what are the statistics? Which statistics do we have? Which statistics do we need? What are the things that measure the character and how they can impact on the game space? Unless you're doing something that's a bit less traditional, where um, the players have some sort of stats that aren't quite simulationist in that sense, that they're more about how much they can do or what kind of things they can say in a story. Mostly your stats are ways that describe who your character is and how they can interact with this with the gaming space in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, in that sense, stats have a dual function. They describe the character, they describe the story element that you have, and they describe how you can use those things to interact with the sort of the fictional space that you're in. Now, in the case of some games like Dungeons and Dragons, that's what we call very simulationist, in the sense that you have statistics that tell you how strong your character is. So that means in the game world, how many things can I carry? What things can I lift? What can I wrestle? What can I, those kind of things. How strong I am at hitting people. And there's a very clear representation between that and the physical avatar in the character. That's something that describes them, and who they are is also what describes how what they can do in the setting, and how they interact with the game. But then you have other game mechanics where that's much less of a direct correspondence. So if you look at something like Fate, or games like that, you often have fate points and drama points, which is something that represents a kind of what they call the authorial stance of the author. So in that case, the player has ways that they can impact into the game world that doesn't directly correspond with something that simulates something in the world. And one of the key things you need to decide as you go into a game is which way you want to take those things in a game design. And there's all sorts of extremes in that direction. You can go all one way or all the other. There are games that are almost like theater sports in that there's no real character control. It's just controlling who talks when. And then there are games like Dungeons and Dragons, which are very, very simulationist, and everything is kind of describing a physical piece. Depending on where you are on that scale, depends on the kind of stats you want. And depending on the nature of the story you're telling, you have to figure out which things are important. Now, the question about what kind of stats to have and how many, that is that is the art of design, and it depends a lot on what you want the game to be about. And I think it's really important to come back to this sort of higher level. So not only deciding how much you want to simulate versus how much you want people to act like authors versus controllers of characters, but also then to think about, well, what is this game as a story going to be about? Where do I want my players' focus to be? I've written a game, for example, that the only statistics in the game were about moral dilemmas, and that it didn't matter how fast or how strong your character was, because that wasn't important. The only question was, how were they going to act when faced with a moral dilemma, because I wanted those things to be right in the focus, and anything else that wasn't that, we could just arbitrate that out. And what people often forget is that that's always what's going on. We have this idea that some things like Dungeons and Dragons have modeled the obvious things that you have to model, but no, they've chosen things that they want to, because they want to have focus on those kind of things. They want to have a focus on whether you use a sword or a bow. That's an important thing. So therefore you need a stat that controls whether you use a sword, and a stat that controls whether you use a bow and how you use those things. And ultimately, strength and dexterity exist in that game, at least partly, if not mostly, to determine the way that how people fight and how they do it differently, and to give that distinction. So D&D is a game that is about combat, because it forces you to go, well, this is something I have to decide. My stats are telling me whether I'm good at fighting with a sword or whether I'm good at fighting with a bow. And that information is right up front, and that's what's the game is telling me matters. So I have to make those kind of choices, and that means I'm going to put those things in the front of my mind, and I'm going to be more likely to enter combat because I have this distinctive factor about myself. So the question of how many stats to have and what stats to have is about where do I want the focus of my game to be, and how complex do I want to make that model to bring those things to the fore. And the complexity is a matter of choice, but the focus is the real heart of the game design, about what you bring to the fore. And very often, again, we have this sort of Dungeons and Dragons idea that there's obviously the things we have to model. People are strong, people are fast, people have health and constitution, people have IQ, and maybe there's always something about charisma and social skills, and very often there's like perception or something. And we think we can just draw these ideas from a simulation of how humans work, but that's generally the wrong way to go about it, because you're actually making hundreds of assumptions there, and you're going to get a story that actually depends on those things and puts those things into the focus. And it's, again, as I say, it's better to step back and go, what do I want the story to be about? And that will determine what your stats should be.
So you treat it a bit like a board game where that you're designing, where you're not trying to simulate, you're trying to do an abstraction that meets your high level goal. So you would start off with, I want to make an RPG in this kind of world where these things happen. I think the characters will probably need these, and then you just cycle backwards and forwards and gradually flesh out the world and how the stats interact and make changes till you're still heading towards that overarching guide point that you set up at the start.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it, is to have a clear goal and try to work towards it. And maybe your goal is that you want to have something that feels like a really accurate simulation of the human body, or some elements of the human body, and has to have some reflection of how people view how humans interact with the world. But it's very easy to get caught up in trying to do that, and then realize that might not be what you want, and to forget that everything is a simulation, everything is an abstraction, everything is a decision of how to abstract things. There is no perfect model. There is no, you don't have to always model constitution or whatever, because there are decisions that you can make about this. I've had people say, oh, look, you can't have a game that doesn't have initiative in it, because obviously how fast you can move and how fast you draw a sword is incredibly important. And it can be, but if those things, that's an assumption that you have made. And the dangerous thing, as always in design, is when you don't know you're making assumptions. And some of the best ways to find new ways to design things is to look at different kinds of assumptions and go, well, what if we didn't make those assumptions? What if speed wasn't important? Why is speed important? Those kind of things. But yeah, as you say, I find the best way for me to design a role-playing game is, and indeed any game, is to have a very clear vision of what we want, and work back and forth with mechanics to try and get that as best as we can.
Yep. So if I do a board game, I might have something like, I want a 2-player game that takes about 20 minutes average, maybe 30 max, with a little bit of take that and some bluffing. And that might be mine. What would you put to one of yours? Like, for example, what was your target for relics?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because you can make some of those questions in role-playing games, and I'm actually working on a game at the moment that I want to make explicitly for 2 players, and that really suits 2 players, not just you can play it with 2 players. Most role-playing games, again, have assumptions built in that there will be one game master, there will be between about 2 and 8 other players, and that you will generally need all those players sort of around to work together and fight the combats. And they'll have to be distinct from each other in various ways, and that they will be able to be played for X amount of time, usually forever, with no sort of, at least until you hit the final level. And again, it's worth looking at some of those assumptions. some of the things that I had for Relics is that I wanted it. I did make some basic assumptions. I did assume there would be a game master. I assumed there would be 2 to 5 other players. So we were looking for things that kept them distinctive. But we did assume also, we assumed that the games would be short. The game is written for 3 to 9 sessions is the general length that you will run a series, or even one-shots. So that was something that was really important. We wanted something that, because that's, I found, where the stories wanted to go. I also wanted stories that were short, because I wanted stories that really got to very exciting high stakes very quickly. So it wasn't interesting to me to do sort of a lot of low level stuff, because I wanted to get the end of the world and killing God or finding God or becoming God to be on the table really quickly. So that was something we were very focused on, having short experiences in terms of campaign length. We also decided that the average game session would be between 2 to 4 hours or so. But again, we assumed towards the shorter side of that. So Relics is written so that it can be run in under 2 hours. And one of our considerations as well was to think about the fact that people are very time poor in this modern age. So we wanted a game that was simple, that was easy to learn, that was accessible to newcomers, although it was quite unique and had a different kind of storytelling mechanic to it. But we did want it to be playable by anybody. And we wanted it to be relatively swift to make a character, to jump in, and to start telling a story as quickly as possible, so that people could, have as few barriers as possible to getting played. So there's a system in the game that has you build your character's background as you play, so that removes the need to be too creative starting in the game, which can be a barrier for some people. To just like, oh, I don't know who I am. This way you can find out, and also you'll be getting flashbacks provided by other people, which was important for us because I really want games to feel cooperative and to feel less like your character totally belongs to you, because I think it's actually that often can really stymie play if players sort of lock their character away and go, this belongs to me and nobody's allowed to mess with it. It stops interaction. So we want interactivity to be a big factor. We wanted, as I say, short-term play in terms of how many sessions, and shorter sessions and accessibility. So these were certainly some of the things we were considering as we were building the system.
Did you find that helped limit or just made it easier to increase the number of stats and skill sets that characters ended up with?
Yeah, certainly having a clear goal, is that what you mean? Yeah.
Or because you say like you can jump in without rolling a character, sort of thing from D&D, and other players help you build your character, your skills, I suppose, from memories. Did you find you had to put any guidance around basically someone saying, "Oh, I remember when you did everything," so suddenly you can do everything, sort of thing?
Yeah, so certainly the system is quite loose and unstructured in some of those ways. There are strict guidelines to stop you from abusing it, but there is, and we don't want to just say, oh, anyone can abuse anything, therefore we're not going to write rules. But this is a game that is based on people working together to tell a shared story, and we didn't want to have to write millions and millions of rules to say, no, don't do this, or only this much. It's a fairly light system in that sense. So there is going to be...
So you can't have more than 10, or you must have, more than 3, and you can't have infinity. You've just basically said, here's the framework, work within it, but try not to be stupid, because you're just going to ruin it for everyone.
Yes, there's a lot of that going on, of like, if you want to ruin this, you absolutely can. But we also, as I said, didn't wash our hands and just go, therefore we're not going to actually design any kind of proper rules. There's an example of what kinds of powers match. We have basically 3 levels of power, so the dealer can sort of say, okay, this is the kind of power level we're at, which tells you what you expect from the characters. and the kind of things they'll be able to do and the kind of opposition they'll face. And actually, Dungeons and Dragons has usually done something like that as well. Like for levels 1 to 5, you are small town characters. You might own one sword. You might only fight, a score of goblins or something and one bugbear. Whereas the high level characters are you're meeting kings and queens, you're finding lots of magical items, and setting expectations is really important. And that's the thing that we talk about a lot with what we call game contracts, or the big concept is that games are often about discussion in the sense, and that happens at the sort of highest level. So you have this sense of what we are providing in the rules is as many benchmarks as possible, so that you can be creative in a way that fits the assumptions that everyone else are making. And so rather than make those assumptions unspoken, the game very clearly says, here's what we think of, here's like 100 examples of what the right level of a skill is. It shouldn't be broader than any of these, it shouldn't be narrower than any of these. Here's an example of what memories look like. It should be like this, it shouldn't be much broader or much narrower than this. This is what the scope of scenarios and stories should be like. These are the kinds of antagonists that you'll be like at this level. These are the kind of powers that you'll be using at this level. We can only give you examples, but by giving you, my theory was to give you as many guidelines as possible, so that when you can free form in that area and make up your own. And I think that to me is a bit more interesting than the way, say, Dungeons and Dragons did it, where there's just a book full of hundreds of spells that you can take and you pick one. Although we do have lists of powers and you can choose them randomly or whatever. We wanted also to just give you that space to go, here's space to create, but to do that we want to give you as many guidelines as possible about what the world that you're operating in feels like. And I think that's really what a lot of role-playing games are, is that they're kind of like a writing Bible, or a series Bible. They talk about that when people work on television shows or on shared novels. There's a list, there's a description not just of what's in the setting, like this is the Federation of Planets and it's led by these guys and it's got humans and Vulcans. There's also a sense of what is the tone, what is the average audience member thinking about, what kind of things happen. What kind of things can't happen. And I think a lot of a role-playing game's job is to communicate that. And it's not just in rules, it's through every aspect, from the art to the way the text is written to the fiction. All those elements exist to try and give everyone at the table a clear picture of the kind of things that are going on, so that everyone can feel free to write together.
I'm glad you mentioned writing, because I know you write stories and stuff. I did the Relic Zine, little plug there. While you're designing your RPGs, do you find that you write little vignettes or stories set in that world, just even if it's just to flesh it out in your head, without bogging it down with technical paraphernalia of the game? But do you do that sort of stuff? And if so, does it keep you on target, or do you find that sometimes they are restrictive, so you may have written a story but you still keep it fairly mutable within the game world?
I think it's a good question, and sometimes you have to go back and forth. Like, you can write a story and then get to the end and go, wait a minute, hang on, that doesn't quite fit what I've said in this other section in the rules, or in the bit where I was talking about the world, not in a non-fiction sense. And being on the same page in those elements is tricky, and that's why you have to spend a lot of time with a game and make sure you do a good editing process to make sure those things all match. So
do you find that if you write the story and you get to the end and go, hang on, that doesn't quite fit what I've said, do you look over the story sometimes and go, but hang on, that makes more sense, and go and make changes in the game itself?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it definitely goes that direction. Where you're writing something, you go, oh, that's really great. I like the way that's come out. That's better than I've actually said in the setting or in the rules. I'm going to make sure that can happen. And we tried to do that a lot during the playtesting as well. If somebody said something and it wasn't, really contradictory, I was like, okay, let's find a way to make that happen, because that's really interesting, and I don't want to. So Relics is written to be very expansive in that way, and to allow all sorts of things to happen, and to, if you have a particularly weird idea, or even not that weird, of what angels is like. Well, here's how you might do that using this system. So fiction can be a way to do that, to sort of experiment, to just sort of see where a story goes, and then see, okay, hang on, does that all match up? It can also be a great way to just see how your world looks as fiction, and to see if it makes sense. But mostly it's also a tool that you are using to communicate those things we were talking about, like the tone of the setting, and the feel of the setting, and the kind of things that happen in the setting. And so fiction in that sense is a tool. It's not just there to entertain the author, the reader. It's also there to say, hey, here's something that might happen. Here's someone who exists in this game world. Here's something who's like someone you might play someone like this. You might do something like this, and that might be interesting. And so a lot of the fiction is in that vein of going, we really want you to see the world in action, in this kind of in an actual fictional sense, because we are hoping that you are evoking a fictional world when you tell stories. And for me, I also like to do this kind of process to other kinds of stories. So like, I watched a whole bunch of Angels movies when I was working on Relics, and then I would go, okay, could that happen in Relics? And is it easy for someone reading Relics to figure out how that would happen? So if someone is watching, the prophecy films, or they're watching Dogma, can they go, oh, I know exactly who that character is. I know how to make that character, and it pops out for them really quickly. So that's using other people's fiction to go, does my game do that? And that can be a really good way actually to make your first game. As I said earlier, is that pick something that already exists. Pick your favorite TV show, pick your favorite book, whatever it is, or your favorite movie, and just go, right, if I gave that, what would I need to create to give to players so that when they sat at a table, they would create something like that movie and the characters in that movie. And that's a really good thing, because you can just keep watching the movie over and over again and go, am I getting there? And then you can play a session and go, did we get close, or did we go somewhere else? How do I fix it? You can actually sort of hone it in until you get right there.
Okay, so that's honing in your design. This next question actually came from Facebook.
Yep.
I can't remember who wrote it, and I didn't put their name in, so sorry. Who should be the primary audience of your RPG?
Yeah, I think Cody was asking that one, and that was about... We often have this question with role-playing games, because we all like to think that anyone is going to stumble into a store and pick up our game and be able to play it. But at the same time, that becomes a very different kind of thing to write to someone who's never played a role-playing game again. You often have to repeat a lot of things, and it can be very boring to read that. So a lot of the hardest things to do with writing a role-playing game is to try to balance that, and to go, look, my audience could be technically anyone. So, yeah, and similarly, you have this issue of how wide do we aim? We'd love for everyone to be reading our games, not just anyone. So like that millions of people might find it, but you also want to have a sense of who your audience is. In a sense that, is your game, for older players, younger players? Relics was designed specifically to be very queer friendly, for example. It's just like our audience is that. Also someone who is perhaps artistic, thoughtful, philosophical. That was sort of our idea of an ideal audience, but we also, again, it was important for us to be open to everyone. It's a tricky question. I mean, it's good to aim for the stars, but a lot of the time your audience is going to be very similar. It's going to be people who've played other role-playing games, because role-playing games are mostly taught through people. People don't stumble upon them and find them on their own as a product. But it's
not like a board game where someone buys the box and reads the rules.
That's right. They're more often taught word of mouth. Yet, as I say, it's still worth assuming, though, that someone who's reading it has no idea what you're talking about. That also helps for clarity, because it means you actually, and it helps with some of those questions I talked about early on about the assumptions you're making. it's worth sitting down and going, I'm not going to assume this person's played hundreds of RPGs. I'm going to explain what I think RPGs are and what I think the rules are for, because people do have different ideas about that. And it's going, and some games talk about responsibilities as well. Like, this is what the GM is supposed to be in charge of. This is what the players are supposed to be in charge of. And we talk about that in Relics a lot. And it's like, your job is to make other people's characters awesome. That's what the flashback system lets you do, because you provide a memory of someone in the past, and that gives you a chance to put them in the spotlight. So it was a clear responsibility that you have to make other people's characters look cool. So your audience, by removing assumptions, you get to the core of what your game is about. So aim wide, I think, is generally a good idea.
Okay, and this one also came from Facebook. Given the structure of your average RPG and the contents it has, i.e. lore, character building rules, guidelines for players and GMs, and content ready to run, how would you prioritize focus in order to increase the value of an RPG to the audience?
Yeah, so value, again, it comes back to how do you give the most amount of information in the best and most efficient possible way so that the players can get playing as quickly as possible. We've already talked about the burden of time and how people have a lot going on these days. And role-playing games aren't always very newbie-friendly. You come into this hobby and they go, here's a 300-page rulebook. You would never introduce anyone to board gaming like that. You wouldn't go, here's a 300-page rulebook, and you can't play till you've read it. So that's an assumption we make, and some of the games I've made address this by being small and easy and quick, and some of them, Relics is more traditional in that it is a big 300-page book that we expect you to read. And so I think lots of designers are trying to grapple with this question in general, and there are lots of interesting ways to answer this question. I think the best thing to do is to have the question on your mind. How am I providing value? And lots of really good games have come across that in different ways. Like the original, when D&D did the player handbook and GM book, that gave you a special book that you could hand to your players and go, take this away, learn from it. It's you could feel like it was yours, and then you could come back, and then there was a separate book that was special that made the GM feel like they had a special information. That was a way of communicating, a way of playing, and it gave a lot of value in that sense. Recently, the Apocalypse World system, like by having class books or whatever they're called, I can never remember, playbooks. They're called playbooks, and again, that's something you can hand to a player, and it becomes theirs. It's like, instead of a character sheet, it's like a little book, and that gives more value, and it has all the rules they need on it, and that is a way of linking them into the game really quickly and giving them a lot of information. So there's really interesting ways that people have answered this question, and there's different kinds of ways to answer it as opposed to just one. It's certainly a fine art, because role-playing games often have a lot of information, and they have complexity to them, and they have the different ways that they can deliver this. I think graphical design plays a huge part as well in giving information over, and I think the answer is to not just pick one way, because sometimes different graphic designs, different mechanical designs, different book designs provide value and get people into the game in different ways, and I think we're still going to be seeing exciting ways to do that. I have an idea of maybe making a game that's delivered as a podcast, or something like that, so you learn it by listening to it, and that way that's a completely different way to get that information to people. Can we do it efficiently? Can we have the right focus? Not sure, but it's an interesting thing to think about. There are
some of that could be driven by the style of game you're making.
Yes, absolutely.
Or the genre or whatever. You might find something that really suits it. Like Relics would have been awesome if you had Skyriders, I suppose. It would sort of fit in with the world in a weird way.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of like, I've written a game that is designed to be played in graffiti, and spread on social media. It's a sort of a storytelling game. You take photos of what the story you've written, and you post it online, and other people can take it and post their own stories. So that's, again, the method depends on the kind of game you want to tell. It's a very difficult question about how to lay out a role-playing game, because you need to know the setting in order to make a character. You need to make a character in order to understand the rules, but you need to understand the rules to know what the character can do and why those things matter. And you can't really understand the world unless you understand who you're playing in it. So you actually knowing what to put first in a book is not fixed, and people have tried all sorts of different ways. Generally there's sort of character generation rules setting ish, but White Wolf tends to put as much of the setting as possible up front in huge chunks. And yeah, there's no real right answer, and I think the answer is to think about what kind of story, what kind of game you're playing, and what works for you. It was,
How do you feel about doing it in roughly the same way you would be teaching it if you were at a convention? So, like, obviously, if you're teaching it at a convention, you've got limited time, so you're hitting the main points that you think they need based on your experience. Writing it in that order would seem to make some sort of logical sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and in a sense, Relics is sort of structured like that. There's a summary of the world first up, and there's like a 1-page summary, and then there's like a slightly longer summary where it goes through the 10 main points, so you can sum it up in 10 things you need to know, and then you're ready to go. And then it's who your characters are, and then it's the basics of the rules, which is what you would work through in a convention setting, but much longer than you would. So we also have the quick start guide, and some games do that. They actually have a quick start guide in the book or in the box. So you'll get like here's how to get here's all you need to know in a player, and it's like a 4-page book or something. Ghostbusters famously did that really well. Had this and games for kids are often great like that. And the playbooks from the Apocalypse world are sort of like that, because they've got almost all the rules on them, so you can just hand it out, and it has that immediacy that you go like, and so you can just go. You can use those kind of tools that you would in a limited amount of time. And yeah, I'd love to see sort of more games thinking in that terms. There's a couple of games. There's a new version of Fiasco coming out that just uses cards entirely. Some games focus really strongly on index cards in general as a way to get people focus on what they need to do, which is writing things down and putting them in the middle of the table so everyone can see them. There's also a game called Slaughter by Australian designer, and it's also about just generating your character really quickly with cards, and that again has that appeal of it's very much focused on the idea of, if you're sitting down at a table, how do we get you to playing the game as fast as possible, and how do we teach that? And board games as well have been experimenting with this in different ways, because they, even though their rules are often smaller, they have the understanding that, especially for younger players or new players, it can be very intimidating. So you have things like the Harry Potter collectible card game, which has these box sets, and you play with box 1, box 2, and they teach you rules as you go.
You don't shuffle this deck when you open it.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, and you'll be drawing this card, then you'll be drawing that card. The first play thing, Legends of Andor famously did that as well. Like, it won an award, one of the Kenneth Spiel Awards, because it had your first game actually stepped out for you in the mechanics, so that you couldn't really learn by reading the rulebook. You had to learn by playing. And
I think Shannon's doing something similar with Runica, using a comic.
Yeah.
To teach you how to play, and it takes you through the first couple of turns or whatever, so that you learn what you can do, and then you can continue the game from there.
Yeah. Comics are a great way to teach rules in general that we should keep using, because they're so visual. And in the Japanese game industry, there's actually a thing called replays, which is a comic of someone playing the game. And in the most extreme version of that, we have things like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, where people are acting out things like Yu-Gi-Oh! Particularly, they actually play the cards and explain the rules in the cartoon. You can't always have that, but in the rule books of role playing games, they have people playing it and telling it in comics. So there's a different way to learn it from just reading it like a textbook. I think the art of teaching complex games or even simple ones is a fascinating one, and we are just beginning to find new ways to do it. And RPGs face a particularly hard battle in some of these because of the complexity. And another way that you can do it, actually, that we haven't mentioned, is that the setting can be communicated not just like an encyclopedia. And some really interesting experimental games have done things like that, where the world is communicated not by here's all the history to read in chronological order, and then here's the geography to read bit by bit per nation. You've got things like Aberrant, which was a superhero game about 20 years ago that gave you just the first half of the book was if you were flicking channels and reading through a magazine, so it was just bits of media from inside the world, and that can be a really fascinating way to, again, to communicate setting without having to read an encyclopedia. And yeah, there's interesting ways to play around with that as well.
Okay, I've got another question, probably from our youngest listener, and this is at the point where you've done your RPG. It may not be completely fleshed out, but you've got it all there, and now you're trying to build a scenario, a story for your players, because you want to include some in the book and or potentially test out your system.
Mm-hmm.
How do you build one and make a story that encourages the players to be creative with different situations? Because in this case, this person found it hard to feel like it only gave them minimal options to still get to the point where you want them to get to. Like, how do you let them have the freedom to explore, but still herd them to the end point that you want?
This is a really big question, and scenario design is it's a related topic to role playing game design, and certainly there's a lot of overlap, and it can be really interesting to think about scenario design as you think about role playing game design. And some of the best, there are ways that you can build things in together. But the usual assumption is that you design a role playing game and then you design the scenarios separately, and there's this very fine art of figuring out this art of can I get them to a plot that I want them to have, but still let them have freedom? And there's a lot of philosophies on this question, and it could be a whole lifetime to learn how to do it. And some people push a lot, but in a way that doesn't feel intrusive, and some people push a little. Some people don't like to plan ahead too much. For me, I like to strike a nice balance. Like, I often have key goals that I want to get to, but I think of it more like there's a menu of options that I have, and a sort of an idea of what might be happening, the timing and structure that things are going on, of what the other characters might be doing, and then I just react to what the players are doing. So I know that that there's a dead body, and if they follow the trail, they'll find who killed them, but I haven't figured out exactly what that trail is. I've got some ideas of evidence, but if they come up with something else, I know I want to get them from the dead body to the place where the killer is. Whatever they come up with that links those scenes is going to be the right thing to do.
So you don't fully script out your scenario. You have your beat points.
That's right. Yeah. And as I say, though, this is just how I approach it. Some people have multiple sort of branching pathways. Some people won't even have anything except I know what happened when the killer killed him. I know vaguely where the killer is now. That's all I care about. I'm going to figure out what cool scenes happening on spec, or they might even have less than that. It's a really big question, and one of the things you can do, as I said, is build some of the. If you're having trouble with some of those things, try to solve them mechanically as well. Like, I'm really interested. There are a lot of really interesting mechanics that have come out of people going, well, how do we think about this from a mechanical point of view rather than just GM skill? For example, in some games like the Buffy RPG, They recognize so there are drama points which you can spend to do cool things. You can succeed really well on a dice, or you can just go, oh, I didn't actually die and come back from the dead and that kind of thing. And they let you manipulate the plot. Same thing in Fate. But you can also give them out in Buffy to sort of, if you ever need to get the players to a certain point because the story will be better there, you can go, okay, look, I'm just going to step in and go, you try to catch them, but you definitely can't. And because of that, you guys get plot points that as a reward, so that later on you can write more creatively. And we actually suggest that option in Relics as well. That's an option that you can go, if you absolutely need to get them from A to B, and it's better to just go, look, I need you to do this, rather than sort of, keep putting barriers in their way. It's better to just come in as the author and use your own voice and go, the cool scene is over here. I'm just going to shift you there arbitrarily, but in return, I'll give you a resource that you can spend. And I think that's that idea of thinking more like an author, again, less like you're trying to simulate something, and encouraging the players to think like authors as well, is a really good idea. If you want to create something that feels like a story, encourage people to act like they're in a story as much as possible. And then they might even have the power, like they can actually have mechanics in some games where you can start scenes. You can just, you can go, oh, I know where the next scene should be. We're just going to cut this scene here, and doesn't matter how we get to the next one because this is a TV show. We just cut to the next scene. We don't show what happened in between. And we can even back justify how everyone is here and things like that. Thinking about things in narrative terms can give interesting mechanics, basically, and solve some of those problems for you. And a lot of people have had lots of different goes at solving these problems in different kinds of ways that, use mechanics as a way to go, well, obviously, we need to think like storytellers and act like storytellers. Even though we're controlling one single character, for the most part, we can still think about how would I approach this, or how would how would this thing exist as a storytelling conceit? So, for example, in Relics, we have this thing where if you need a skill, you can have a flashback to when you learnt that skill. Now, that technically wouldn't make sense. If I wanted to pick a lock and then someone goes, oh, remember that time you were stealing cars 50 years ago. Now, 10 minutes earlier in the game, I might have needed to pick a lock and decided not to have a flashback. And now suddenly I've got that skill, even though I had it 50 years ago. That is from a pure simulationist point of view, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But from a you can see that would happen in a movie or a story. So it has that sort of sense of unreality to the storytelling. And we encourage the players to think like this. And that sense of thinking in terms of a story, as opposed to we are these actual people in this real world, can help your players be ready to go with the flow and to choose dramatic actions. A lot of it is also about safety, and we talk a lot about that in Relics, is that players are afraid that they're going to get screwed. And that's why they don't always want to do what the GM wants them to do, because they think that they're in danger. You only have one playing piece in a role-playing game, and it's your character, and at any time, the GM can basically say, oh, no, you're dead. You failed a roll, you rolled a 1, which you have no control over, and then you get stabbed in the head and you die, and you lose your whole playing piece, which you have an enormous amount of connection to. And so a lot of what's going on when players are like saying, I don't want to go into the raging storm and fight the bad guy, I'll wait till morning, is that they're worried that they're not safe. And so mechanics like we were talking about, like plot points and story points and things like that, or thinking like an author, can help your players go, oh, I am safe. My GM can even say things like, I'm not going to kill you this turn because it's not the finale of the movie yet, or something like that that's actually explicit. But also you can build mechanics in to go, look, you can't, you're not going to die at this point because the game isn't written like that. There are ways out. There are 0 hit points doesn't mean death. It just means you lose your ability to impact the scene. Anything like that you can do that builds safety will help your players want to do more dramatic things. It's all about people are only going to be dramatic if they feel safe, and so many role-playing games are written against that concept. They make it harder and harder to do cool things, makes you less and less safe. And that's something that's really important to think about. It's like, what do I want my players to do? How do I want my players to behave? And that's really the core of game design in general, is that it's not just about whether the characters and the mechanics evoke the setting, but how does it make the players react? And you can build a great world that creates, that accurately reflects, the Three Musketeers. But if the players feel like they're going to die if they swing on a chandelier, they're not going to do it. So everything comes back to this sort of sense that same thing in board games is like, if I want people to take risks in board games, I have to have a high reward. If I want people to take risks in RPGs, I want that there should be a reward, or there should be a safety net to catch them. So when you're designing plots, think about where people are going, and if they feel safe and if they feel open to making these kind of choices.
Okay, and that probably gets back to your overall intent for the actual game when you were designing it. If you design it where everything is a life-threatening action, then you have to be prepared for them potentially not doing what you want them to do because of that risk that you've imbued in the game.
Exactly. And the more harsh and brutal your world is, the less likely they are to take risks and to go where you want them to, because they have their own survivability in their brain. And
conversely, if you make it too open and easy, they may never get there because they just keep wandering, and then you've got to pull that plot point and teleport them.
Yes, that's right. And I think just you can definitely put these things in at the system level, but you can also just come in and say, look, this is the kind of game I want to run. This is where the next plot point is. Let's just cut to there. Too much freedom can be as restrictive in a way as too little.
Okay, well, the hour is nearly up, so I am going to do my best to summarize what I've picked up tonight, and hopefully it helps other people. And then I don't know what you want to do after that, if you want to open up to more questions.
Yeah, sure.
But I'll lead in. So what I got from tonight was start off with a high-level aim for the game. Like, do you want it to be a storytelling game? Do you want it to be a simulation? Start scoping out your world. What the setting is, what things at a high level happen, what you want the characters to be able to do, and that will help drive the development of any stats or characteristics that they might have. If you want, write some short vignettes or something just to flesh out the world and keep it a bit clearer in your head, and just loop backwards and forwards through all of those, gradually refining it and going into more detail to make sure that your game world is going to let players do what you want them to do. And then as you start to develop it and write it down, try at least at first putting it down in the order that you're teaching it to people.
Yep.
Make any aids if you see that people are having problems with that sort of stuff, and then also set guidance for your GMs if you're going to use a GM, so that they have a clear idea of how to get players to move around in the world. So GM is responsible for setting the scene, setting the parameters on how tough or strict or lenient everything will be, and give the players some sort of power to influence the story without it being a detriment to the overall story arc. Is that a really high-level summary of what we've done?
That's hit the big notes. I mean, it's have a clear vision, and think about it as an exercise in communication, I guess, is what all these things have come back to, is that you have to communicate what your world is, and you communicate that through every part of the rules, every part of the book, and everything that you're giving to these people. So it's also how you teach it, how you present it, and all of that is hoping to communicate and suggest to players a way to play, a way to create, a way to act. If they're not acting the way that you want them to, then you go back to the drawing board and try something else. And it's the same with any kind of game design. Is you play test, and see what happens. So yeah, if there's anyone else in the chat room who has a question, feel free to yell it out or type it into.
Just remember to take yourselves off mute.
That's right. You're all on mute at the moment.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
It doesn't look like anyone is typing or jumping off mute at this moment. So I'm going to assume that everyone has had all their lovely questions answered.
Well, everyone knows how to get in touch with you if they haven't.
That's right. So we encourage you to, so the Game Jam is coming up. It starts on the 31st of January. I'll just check how long. Is it 24 hours?
72, I think. Normally starts 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Summer Time on Friday and finishes 48 hours, I think 6 p.m. on the Sunday.
Yep.
Just look it up online, Global Game Jam. Find a site nearby. Oh, look at that.
Yep, globalgamejam.org. Oh, Chris has posted a link, yes, in there. Yeah, so globalgamejam.org. And you don't have to join a group or go to an event if you don't want to. You can do it all on your own or with just a friend that you have down the street or something, as casual as you like or as official as you like. And
I've rocked up to the Canberra one and taken my tabletop stuff and sat there, and there's a whole bunch of people turn up, depending what you're into. There's artists that are looking for someone to work with. There's musicians. There's programmers. You could end up designing a PC game and playtesting that. Just do it. It's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And
it's really tiring.
Don't feel it is tiring. It'll be hard work, but don't feel like you need to have any sort of amount of skill to give it a go. And that's really important about role-playing games as well, is people either think that it's too hard or they try to do too much. They go, well, I want to create a role-playing game. I've looked at Dungeons and Dragons. It is 300-page books. I need to make that. And that's the kind of thing that you're probably not going to finish, especially as your first time out. So you can make a role-playing game that's 1 page long, that fits on a postcard, that fits in a tweet. Think about...
Speaking from experience there, Steve.
Yes, I've written all of those things. And as long as it's got, a description of the world and a description of who you're playing in it and the kind of stories you're telling and how to tell those, that's a role-playing game. So, set your scope appropriately and make your first role-playing game, because the first one's the hardest and then they start to get easier. And
there's also that annual 200-word challenge.
Yeah, there's so many little ways that you can get into role-playing game design. The 200-word RPG challenge is great, again, just for getting that first step of something down on paper. There's also lots of game jams around the world, not just Global Game Jam. And find me on Twitter or Facebook. On Twitter, I'm at Tinstar Games. I'm Steve D on Facebook, or Tinstar Games has a page on Facebook. I'm always happy to give you tips for making that first RPG, getting it across the end of the line, and getting it into other people's hands to play, and then see how you go. But yeah, it's RPGs are a great place to start for your first game, because they have a fairly set format, and they don't have to be that big or that complex or that perfectly balanced, because there are storytelling exercises. So it's a great way to start your first game, is to make a role-playing game. So we're going to leave it there, I think.
Chris was just typing something, but he stopped.
Oh, it's just
there we go. Dates.
The dates are being added: Friday the 31st to Sunday the 2nd of February. So yeah, please enjoy the Global Game Jam. Please check out Queerly Represent Me, which is an amazing resource run by 2 Australian ladies who are just getting as much queer representation into games as possible, and encouraging queer developers and queer designers to make their content and share their content. And we really encourage those people to, if you're any kind of minority, don't be shy. There is a space for you, and Queerly Represent You. Queerly Represent Me is going to help you carve out that kind of space. And I'm sure most Global Game Jam events will be very accepting to all sorts of people. They generally are. And so there's all sorts of reasons to give it a go, and check out Queerly Represent Me, which I think is just at Queerly Represent Me on Twitter as well, and ask for help, because we're all in different stages, and the best teacher is often the person who's just a little bit ahead of you. And mostly in the game design community, people are very keen to help and very generous. So yeah, just try and ask and go. I'll say a final thank you to Sean for such excellent questions, and anyone else who sent in questions on Facebook and Twitter. And
yes, thank you, everyone.
And thanks for Sean for helping me run this. Hopefully
No
it was
problems.
a bit more interesting than just me talking for an hour. All right.
Well,
that's all.
Thank you all.
Yep. We'll talk to you after you've made your first role-playing game.